1 in 7 men having no friends is not a soft stat problem. It is a civilization-level warning sign. So if loneliness is that widespread, why do we still treat male struggle like a personal failure instead of a system in collapse? Because the second you start asking that question, the whole conversation gets uncomfortable fast. And that's exactly where this discussion is about to begin. Hi, that stat about someone dying every 90 minutes is brutal. And most of them being men just makes the silence around it feel insane. What gets me is how quickly people turn compassion into blame. Like, if a woman is struggling, everyone suddenly sees a system. If a young man is struggling, it becomes, fix your life, bro. That double standard is so obvious once you hear it out loud. And then nobody acts shocked when a bad actor fills the vacuum. The part about 1 in 7 men having no friend is wild to me. 1 in 7, not 1 in 70? That is not just loneliness, that is structural disappearance. And people still want to pretend this is only about attitude. If a whole cohort has fewer friends, fewer dates, less money, something is broken. Do you buy the argument that biology is part of it? Because that can get abused really fast. But the school stuff is harder to dodge. Boys getting punished harder for the same behavior is not a small detail. Apparently, cheating on a chemistry test has different pricing depending on your gender. That's such a ridiculous sentence, but here we are. And if most primary teachers are women, where do boys even model themselves? That missing male role model piece feels like the real trigger. Not because one man saves everything, but because somebody has to say, do this, not that. Without that, you can drift for years and not even notice. And then the economy hits you while you're already off balance. 47 for a first home is insane. 47 is not adulthood, that's a second career phase. The dream has been rescheduled to middle age. That delay changes how men see themselves completely. If society tells you your worth is economic, then low wages become identity damage. That shame turns into rage pretty quickly. And rage online is basically free electricity for extremists. That's the scary part. The empty space becomes a market. What did you make of the dating piece, though? Because swipe culture feels like a machine that prints rejection. 1,000 swipes for one coffee is not romance, it's hazing. And then people act surprised when men log off and never come back. Rejection is supposed to build character, but too much of it just freezes people. Especially when the alternative is staying home and getting fake comfort instantly. Netflix, porn, food delivery, and a personality collapse. That is the modern trap in one sentence. And porn is the one nobody wants to touch, honestly. The argument isn't moral panic, it's opportunity cost. If your whole night is engineered to avoid risk, your life gets smaller. That part about learning to endure rejection matters way beyond dating. Hiring, sales, entrepreneurship, friendships, all of it is rejection management. You don't get strength without a few humiliating misses. And AI makes the avoidance easier, which is the nightmare. Because now you can simulate company without actually becoming lovable. Tiny dopamine, zero dignity, very efficient product. That's such a cynical way to describe the future, but also not wrong. The sex bot thing sounds absurd until you remember some people will choose anything over nothing. That's the real competition, not a perfect relationship. It's the couch versus the mess of being alive. And the couch is winning too often. What I liked is the advice was actually boring in the best way. Make money, get fit, spend time around people, learn to take hits. No magic, no 6-step redemption arc, just basic human software. And the money advice is less about status than momentum. Get a job, any legal job with a path, then stack competence. I like the warning about passion being confused with a hobby. Everybody wants to be a DJ until rent is due. That's mean, but it's also a public service. The stoic piece is underrated too, because debt becomes a mental tax. If you are broke, then every impulse purchase is a little betrayal. And young people are getting hunted by algorithms at their weakest moment. The app knows when you're tired, insecure, and one click away from a bad decision. That's not freedom, that's extremely polite exploitation. The women's side of this is more complicated, though. Because successful women are also lonely, just in a different shape. The issue is they can actually find attention, but not necessarily the right person. Online dating gives access to everyone and depth to nobody. That is the bleakest user experience ever designed. And the high-earning men at the top just don't have enough incentive to settle. which creates this weird bottleneck where everybody is chasing the same tiny pool. Then the rest of the field feels invisible and starts checking out. That is how a social system can rot without anyone declaring failure. And still, women usually keep social webs alive better than men do. Men lose the relationship and then lose the friends, too. That cascade is what makes this feel so dangerous. If you're 21, what would you actually tell a guy first? Because just saying be confident is useless. I'd say build a boring little life that can survive rejection. Make some money, lift weights, leave the house, and keep getting embarrassed. That is such a harsh onboarding packet for adulthood. But honestly, it sounds more useful than most advice men get. Because the real danger is not failure, it's numbness. If a guy never gets rejected, he never develops the skin to keep going. And if he never keeps going, he disappears from his own life. That line should honestly scare people more than it does. Yeah, because this is not just about men being sad. It's about whether a whole generation can still tolerate reality. And next time we need to get into what society can actually do about it. Episode 2 is where this gets even messier because the fixes are not simple. The weirdest part is how quietly this collapse happened. Nobody woke up and said, let's isolate men and call it progress. It just stacked up through school, money, dating, and screens. Then suddenly you're looking at suicide stats like they came from nowhere. They didn't come from nowhere, they came from friction getting removed. Wait, friction getting removed is such a brutal way to say it. But it's true, we keep sanitizing the hard parts of becoming a man. And then we act shocked when men can't handle hard things. That's like taking weights out of the gym and blaming people for being weak. Exactly, and the weightless gym is basically modern adolescence. The school piece hit me hardest because boys are getting suspended way more. For the same behavior too, which is where it starts feeling crooked. If the first institutions you meet punish you harder for the same mistake, you learn the wrong lesson. You learn that the system is not for you, or worse, that you are the problem. And then there are barely any male teachers in early education. That part is huge because boys do not just need instruction, they need reflection. A male role model is basically proof that adult manhood exists beyond memes. Beyond memes is a low bar, but somehow we're still missing it. And when the home is unstable, school becomes even more important. That single mother point mattered too because the substitution was never one thing. It was government, mentors, coaches, neighbors, random men stepping in. Which is almost beautiful, and also kind of tragic that it had to be pieced together. Because not every kid gets that patchwork. Most kids get the version where nobody steps in until it's already bad. Then the internet shows up pretending to be a father, a friend, and a therapist. And sometimes a financial advisor, which is somehow worse. Bro, yes, because now the algorithm is raising your son. And the algorithm is terrible at boundaries. The dating piece feels like the next trapdoor, though. Because without offline friction, men lose the muscle for real contact. They go from classrooms to apps to isolation with almost no bridge. And the app economy makes rejection feel industrial. Right? It's not one woman saying no, it's 1,000 little erasures. That kind of rejection doesn't just sting, it edits your identity. And then porn and gaming and doom scrolling become the easier exit. The couch becomes a philosophy. That's actually nasty but accurate. The bigger issue is that these substitutes feel like life without demanding life. Low-risk intimacy, low-risk purpose, low-risk everything. And low risk is not what builds a man, or frankly, a functioning adult. It just builds a person who can avoid pain very efficiently. Which sounds healthy until you realize pain avoidance is its own prison. The money piece is where it gets almost uncomfortably practical. Because for men, money is still tied to dignity whether we like it or not. Human beings are so evolved until rent is due. Rent is the final boss of self-esteem. And the terrifying stat is that younger adults are worse off than their parents. Men under 40 being less wealthy than before is not a small shift. Add the average first home buyer being in their 40s, and the dream starts looking delayed on purpose. Delayed enough, and it stops being a dream and becomes resentment. And resentment is when bad politics starts feeling emotionally useful. That's the ugly pipeline nobody likes saying out loud. What do you think is the most dangerous myth here? That if men are struggling, compassion somehow means excusing bad behavior. Yes, like empathy is a moral contamination. People act like caring about men is a gateway drug. A gateway drug to what? Basic human decency? Exactly, and that guilt trip keeps the conversation stuck. But I also get why people recoil because the void got filled by uglier voices. Right, if decent people won't speak, the loudest idiots own the microphone. And then young men mistake cruelty for clarity. That is the real nightmare. The loneliness numbers are almost too absurd to process. 1 in 7 men with no friends is not a personal failure story, it's a social emergency. And 1 in 4 without a best friend is just devastating. Because friendships are not decorative, they're infrastructure. Infrastructure for what specifically? For surviving rejection, for getting honest feedback, for not disappearing inside your own head. When that disappears, every setback feels terminal. And then comes the really strange part, women are changing too. They are more educated, earning more, owning more, and that changes the mate pool. Which means the old matching scripts are broken on both sides. Women don't want to date down. Men can't always date up, and everyone is confused. Modern romance, sponsored by spatial incompatibility. That's insane, but yes, that's the vibe. The difference is, women usually still have stronger social scaffolding. Men more often just fall through the floor. And that makes the female loneliness story look different, not smaller. Exactly, because women may be single, but many still have friendships and networks. Men tend to lose the romantic lane and the friendship lane together, which is why the crash lands harder. The thing I keep circling back to is this off-ramp idea. If a young man doesn't have a place to go, he'll take the easiest exit. And the easiest exit is always digital, passive, and empty. So the real question is how to rebuild the hard path without making it feel humiliating. Because nobody wants to be preached into adulthood. Especially not by someone who looks like they were born holding a lecture deck. Which sadly is most of society. The better move is probably making challenge feel normal again. Rejection, work, movement, friends, embarrassment, all of it. Basically, a life that still contains weather. A life that contains weather is a perfect line, by the way. Because right now, too many young men are living in climate control. And climate control can look calm right before it gets sterile. That sterility is what eventually breaks people. We should probably sit with that instead of rushing past it. Yeah, because the next part is where the fixes start getting political. And that's where everyone suddenly gets very nervous. Good, they should. We come back and get into the fixes because that is where the fight starts. Episode 2 is where this gets even messier because the fixes are not simple. The part that hits me is how quietly this is happening. Like, people notice the collapse only after it gets expensive. Exactly. And by then it is already loneliness, rage, and bad habits. The bill arrives wearing a suit and carrying a spreadsheet. That is such a terrible image, but yeah, that is the point. We keep talking about young men like they just need a pep talk. But this sounds more like an off-ramp problem than a motivation problem. Off-ramp is the perfect word because a lot of them never find one. No job path, no friendship path, no dating path, no mentor path. Then everybody acts surprised when they disappear into a screen. What I found interesting is how much of this starts before adulthood. The school system, the male role models, the early social sorting, all of it. And the hard part is people hear that and think you are excusing bad behavior. But explaining a system is not excusing the person trapped in it. Apparently, compassion now needs a legal disclaimer. Seriously, every time men are mentioned, someone reaches for the fire extinguisher. And that leaves the worst voices to fill the silence. That part mattered to me because the vacuum does not stay empty. If decent people are afraid to talk, the loudest idiots win by default. That is how the whole thing gets uglier. The biology piece is where people get twitchy, though. But if you look at impulse control and development, that is not a cartoon theory. It is just uncomfortable because it sounds like unfairness has a design attached to it. And then you add the school bias, suspension patterns, and missing male teachers. That male role model gap is doing way more damage than people admit. Especially when one generation loses fathers, uncles, coaches, and teachers all at once. It is like the structure is there, but nobody is holding the door. And then economic reality comes in and kicks the whole thing over. If you are a man and your economic value is slipping, your identity takes a hit fast. Because society still acts like male worth is tied to earning power. Nothing says modern masculinity like being judged by your rent. Brutal but true. The homeownership number alone is wild because 47 is not a starting point. Imagine being told the dream is still there. Just wait 20 more years. At that point, the dream is renting itself to you. And dating just becomes another arena where men feel numerically rejected. That swipe economy is really corrosive when you say it out loud, because it turns ordinary men into a kind of statistical humiliation machine. One coffee for 1,000 swipes is not romance, that is a casino with bad lighting. A casino with worse odds and more ghosting. And if you never get the reps in person, you do not learn the social skills either. That is the part people miss when they just say, go outside more. Outside is not a therapy slogan, it is where confidence gets built. Rejection is not optional if you want to become socially durable. And the weird thing is, parents now fear too little risk instead of too much. That overprotected childhood creates adults who fold the first time life pushes back. Which is why the sanitized childhood becomes the brittle adulthood. Exactly, and then porn and screens become the easiest substitute. The porn point is strong because it is not moral panic, it is allocation. Time, attention, energy, all of it gets rerouted away from the real world. And if the algorithm can keep you home, it absolutely will. The market does love a lonely customer. That line is evil, but it is also exactly right. What scares me most is how quickly digital convenience becomes emotional dependence. Friendship, dating, gambling, scrolling, all of it looks like connection from far away. But it is mostly low-friction imitation. And low-friction imitation is a terrible life strategy, especially when the real reward only exists after discomfort. Like the whole point of effort is the reward at the end. The AI and sexbot piece sounds absurd until you remember how lonely people behave. If the choice is rejection or a machine that flatters you, some people will choose comfort. That is depressing, but it is not hard to imagine. The real tragedy is that comfort can become a coffin. And once a young man stops taking risks, his world gets smaller every month. That is why the physical world matters so much in this conversation. Real friendships, real work, real workouts, real rejection, real momentum. You cannot replace that with vibes and a charging cable. Sadly, a lot of people are trying. The women's side of this is fascinating because the pain is different, not absent. The over 30 woman who feels stuck is dealing with a real mismatch too. Career success does not automatically solve intimacy, and that is the trap. Especially when the dating pool gets more selective in both directions. Women are gaining economic power, but the viable mate pool keeps shrinking. And men who could be good partners often are not acting like partners yet. So both sides are waiting for a person who does not exist yet. It is romantic capitalism with worse customer service. That is disgusting but somehow accurate. What I do like is the practical turn at the end. Make money, lift weights, get around people, tolerate rejection. That is not glamorous, but it is useful. It is basically anti-delusion as a life plan. And honestly, young men need that more than inspiration. They need structure that does not humiliate them. Because shame alone does not produce growth, it produces hiding. Right? And hiding is where the spiral gets mean. That is the whole story, really. Not that young men are broken beyond repair, but that the repair kit is missing. And everybody keeps arguing about who is allowed to care. That is why this conversation matters so much. Next one is going to make people even more annoyed. Good, because episode 2 is where the fixes stop being polite. We are going there next, and that is where things get loud. The brutal part is how early this starts going sideways. Like before anyone is even called an adult. A boy can just drift for years and nobody clocks it. Then suddenly everyone acts surprised by the collapse. That is such a bad system. What hit you first in all this? The suicide stat is the one that refuses to leave the room. One death every 90 minutes is insane. And most of them being men makes the silence look absurd. We keep pretending that is a side issue. It is weird how fast compassion changes shape there. For women, we call it a crisis. For men, we call it a character lesson, which is a very elegant way to do nothing. And then the void gets filled by the loudest idiot in the room. That is the part people should be scared of. Because lonely men are easy to recruit into nonsense. Not because they are evil, but because they are available. The education piece was uglier than I expected. Boys are getting punished harder for the same behavior. That suspended for the same thing detail is wild. If the system reads you as trouble, you start acting like trouble. And then people blame the boy like he invented the rubric. The role model point feels even bigger than school. Yeah, because it is not just discipline, it is identity. If no adult man ever shows up, the internet absolutely will. And the internet is a terrible uncle. A terrifying uncle, honestly. That missing male presence seems to be the actual fault line. Not a vibe, not a slogan, a fault line. Then the economy comes in and kicks the whole thing over. 40-year-olds are broke and 30-year-olds are behind their parents. First-time homebuyers at 47 is bananas. If adulthood keeps arriving late, shame just keeps compounding. And men still get judged hardest on money first. That part is old-fashioned in the worst way. It is strange that women can outrun men economically and still pay the social penalty of singlehood. That double bind is brutal. People keep calling it empowerment until the dating market gets weird. Then everybody suddenly becomes a philosopher. Exactly, and none of them are helpful. The dating piece is where the loneliness becomes visible. Swipe culture made everyone feel replaceable. And average men got hit with the worst math imaginable. 1,000 swipes for one coffee is not romance, that is erosion. Rejection is supposed to teach you something, not flatten you. But I do think the rejection argument matters. The ability to take a hit and stay in the game is enormous. Life is basically a rejection subscription. That should be stitched on a pillow somewhere. And now technology keeps offering a fake exit ramp. That is the sex bot and AI piece, right? Yeah, the temptation is to choose low-risk fake intimacy over real risk. Which sounds harmless until nobody can tolerate real people anymore. Porn fits into that same trap too. Because it trains men to consume desire without building character. And it quietly eats all the hours that could become a life. That is the part nobody wants to say out loud. Phones are basically little collapse machines if nobody intervenes. The advice on money was more practical than people expect. Make some money, find a useful skill, and live below your means. Revolutionary stuff, apparently. The fact that it sounds revolutionary is the problem. A plan is attractive because it signals direction, not just income. That is such a clean point. Nobody wants to date a drift packet. That is awful and completely true. The fitness part matters too, because it gives men a physical off-ramp. Something to build before they have status. Exactly, strength can become a first proof of self-respect. And maybe the real issue is nobody is teaching that sequence anymore. Like money first, then movement, then community? More or less because the order actually matters. You cannot therapize someone out of total aimlessness. You can, however, give them a calendar. That is cold, but yes. And maybe that is the real theme here. Not saving men from masculinity, but giving them a route back into society. Because without an off-ramp, the spiral just keeps printing damage. And nobody gets to pretend they did not see it coming. That is where I want to leave it for now. Episode 2 gets into what actually fixes this, and that is the messy part. Because the fixes are where people start yelling,